Jason, do you want to tell me the difference between a Heim joint, a rubber bushing, and a flex joint?
So obviously a rubber bushing is the same as what comes in a factory control arm. That is a factory rubber bushing. They have a rubber bushing on both ends. They're soft for creature comfort, so when the axle takes a bump, they're squishy. The rear end will move and absorb some of the impact. For in our world, not necessarily the best thing, because when you start twisting them, you start cycling suspension, start flexing it hard. Eventually the rubber bushing will come apart. You have the outer sleeve, the rubber bushing, and then you have a solid steel sleeve that goes through the center of it. Well, the steel sleeve is also what carries the bolt. So anytime the suspension twists, so you flex it, that steel sleeve and the outer housing does that number. So you're just constantly wearing on the rubber bushings, and they're eating themselves apart basically, for long story short. They work great for, a street driven Jeep that you're just gonna drive to the mall and not take it off road. The more off-roading you do, the faster the acceleration of the bushing deteriorating in the long run. You have the flex joint, which is what we use. We use them in both ends. So we use the rubber bushing in the axle end to help absorb, some of the impact. They're a little softer. They give you a little bit better ride. But at the chassis end, we use the flex joint from Summit Machine, which is a rebuildable rigid joint. It's not gonna move till things start wearing a little bit, and you can go in and tighten them or replace the guts. But that is a solid joint. But that joint is designed, if you break it all down in the long scheme, the centerpiece, what would be the sleeve and a rubber bushing, has a ball in the center of it. The backing washer, and you have one race, the joint, the other race, and then this spanner adjuster. It all drops into this housing, and this is how you adjust your preload. We torque them to what Jolene says, which is about 35 foot-pounds. But it's an oil impregnated race. I don't know if the camera will pick it up, but you can see these the spirals that are in here. That's so that grease can get around the ball.
Okay.
So you're not just, when this is all together in the joint, it says something like that. So you're not only just filling that cavity full of grease. That's what them spirals and the races are for. So the grease, once it builds pressure with the grease gun, it pushes the grease through that spiral. These are oil impregnated. You almost don't have to grease them, but they will squeak and they will make noise like Heim Joint. You put a little bit of grease in them, they'll last longer. They have lubrication so that the ball can, do this number, can cycle around and do this number as suspension moves. It's free to move, but the grease it's lubrication just like anything else. Lack of maintenance will create wear. Stay on top of it with a grease gun and these joints will last forever. It will always pivot, if that makes sense. You'll always be able to get deflection out of it, but it will stay solid. There's no give and take. There's a ball and everything, the housing will move around it. That's why we do mixed. So the rubber bushing will absorb some of the road, bumps and whatnot in the road. And the flex joint, the off-road side, will do all the work. Instead of the two rubber bushings fighting each other on the, each end of the control arm. Now you have a joint that's capable of moving and flexing. So the rubber bushing doesn't see any load for the most part off-road. It'll when the axle comes up and rotates, it'll rotate the flex joint at the chassis end instead of the two bushings trying to fight each other. Now, if we're talking really ridiculous wheel travel and you run the flex joint out of movement, well, then the bushing has to take over the rest of the movement. In your average daily driver, weekend warrior Jeep, you're not playing with that kind of amount of wheel travel to run the flex joint out of movement. We can talk into Heims, which you see a lot of more rock bouncers, more racers running them. They're not rebuildable. They are what they are. They're a solid rigid joint. They're the hardest joint out there, but you can't rebuild them. So like race cars, rock bouncers, them guys use a lot of Heim joints. They're beating on things really very hard. We've ran flex joint, some machine joints for years, and my personal opinion, I'd run the flex joint over a Heim joint any day. Mainly because you can rebuild them, and I've yet to see one of some machine joints fail. And you can grease them, you can rebuild them. A Heim joint, they squeak. They're fine for a little bit. Well, in our industry, we play in the dirt, we play in the sand, and once those start working into the joints, they start squeaking, and squeaks drive me nuts, and there's no way to get rid of it.
That sand and mud would start wearing away with it.
It starts eating at the fit of the ball socket in the Heim joint, and there's nothing you can do about it. So eventually they'll start clunking because it'll start eating the bushing out of them, and you can't rebuild them. The only way to fix them is put a new Heim joint in it. Say you have them on both ends of the four control arms. Rough math, that's almost $2,000 worth of Heim joints.
Wow.
And one end. You still have the other end to do too.
Right.
So all of a sudden you're talking $4,000 or $5,000 in Heim joints to replace them all. And we've ran them for years. My TJ that I used to have, I go through the suspension every year just to check it over. Most of the time it was just tighten the spanner up, put more grease in it, put them back in, and go on your way. They don't really wear or fail. They can if you don't take care of them and just drive them. But even the ones in this, because this has all of our short arms in it, so it has a some machine joint at the chassis, and it has a clevite bushing, so a factory bushing at the axle end. I've yet to replace these joints. They squeak, put a couple bits of grease in them, and I do the same thing. I'll check them about once a year, drop them down. Once you start getting a little bit of a clunk, more than likely, things are starting to wear. But you pull the set screw out, tighten the collar one notch, put the set screw back in, and drive it away. Clunk's gone. When you order one of our long arm kits, it's assembled, powder coated, it's ready to be installed on the vehicle.